They were born into a world already burning. By the time these boys could read, war was the only story they knew. Their fathers had marched before them, their teachers spoke of glory, and every poster on every cracked wall promised the same thing: to fight was to belong. Germany in the early 1940s was not a nation. It was an idea, a fever that reached into the cradle. The regime didn't need to steal children's innocence. It replaced it. Songs, uniforms, parades, everything around them whispered the same message: you were born for this. At school, lessons began not with arithmetic but with oaths. Boys stood in straight lines, arms outstretched, swearing loyalty to faces on posters they had never met. They memorized slogans before they learned geography, marched before they could dance. The textbooks called it duty. The truth was simpler. They were being raised under heavy propaganda, molded to believe that war was not horror, but honor. At 12, they wore brown uniforms and carried wooden rifles. At 14, they learned how to throw grenades. By 16, some were already in uniform for real. Not because they dreamed of conquest, but because it was all they were ever taught to dream of. The Hitler Youth was not a choice. It was the air they breathed, the rhythm of their days. On weekends, they hiked through forests singing songs about courage and sacrifice. They competed in drills, learned to obey without question, and were told that doubt was weakness. The adults cheered them on, proud, desperate, or simply afraid to do otherwise. For most of these boys, the war began long before they held a weapon. It began in classrooms and playgrounds, where words became bullets and stories became commands. They were told that their country was surrounded by enemies, that mercy was foolish, and that victory was a kind of purity. Every newspaper headline fed that hunger. Every speech told them they were special, chosen, unstoppable. But behind the slogans were empty cupboards and missing fathers. The older brothers who'd gone east and never come back. The mothers who waited by the radio for names that never came. The children grew up watching grief wear a uniform. And yet, even as the bombs fell on their cities, they were told to believe, to keep faith in a world collapsing around them. When the war began to turn, when defeat crept in like a shadow, the propaganda grew louder, more desperate. In 1944, posters appeared showing boys no older than 15 holding anti-tank weapons, smiling bravely beneath the words, "Our future fights for victory." Their future, sitting in classrooms, dreaming of nothing but survival, had been stolen and wrapped in flags. To be young in that world was to live inside a lie so complete that it felt like truth. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to fight. They were raised for it. They didn't ask why. They were told not to. In the final winter of the war, entire battalions of schoolboys were assembled into what was called the Volkssturm, the People's Army. The name sounded noble. In reality, it was desperation given form. Teachers handed rifles to students. Priests blessed them. Some boys didn't even have boots, just wooden clogs or worn shoes wrapped in rags. But they marched anyway. The front was moving closer every day, and the adults had run out of men. Imagine being 16, handed a weapon heavier than your arm, told to stop tanks rolling from the west. Imagine hearing your commanding officer, barely older than you, say that surrender was treason, that the enemy would show no mercy. And you believed it, because you had to. Because all your life, that's what they had told you. They were not monsters. They were scared, half-starved, and lost in a story written by men who would never pay the price. In the ruined streets of small towns, they dug trenches they barely understood how to defend. They waited in the cold, clutching their rifles, repeating fragments of speeches they no longer fully believed. They talked about home, about mothers, bread, warmth. Some still carried schoolbooks in their pockets, pages smudged with dirt. Others kept photographs of their families wrapped in cloth, as if the image could protect them. At night, when the air raids howled overhead, they tried to remember the hymns they'd sung as children. The sound of bombs drowned everything. In the darkness, one truth began to grow, quiet but undeniable. This was not glory, it was fear. But the system around them couldn't allow that thought. Their officers told them that the Americans would kill them on sight, that surrender was worse than death. Stories spread like wildfire tales of brutality invented to keep them obedient. The propaganda that had once promised greatness now weaponized their terror. Don't be taken alive, they were told. Fight to the last. It wasn't courage that kept them in the trenches. It was confusion, fear, and the weight of everything they'd been made to believe. And yet, Even in that final chaos, there were moments when the cracks showed. Some boys, standing guard in the rubble of their hometowns, watched columns of refugees move past families like their own, carrying what little was left. They saw the truth not in speeches, but in silence, in the empty eyes of their neighbors. Still, orders were orders. They were told to defend Germany to the end, even as Germany itself lay in ruins. They followed adults who no longer believed in victory, but couldn't admit defeat. So the boys fought because they didn't know how not to. Many never fired a shot. When the Americans or British finally arrived, they often found frightened teenagers too shocked to resist. Some hid in basements, others simply walked out of the woods with their hands raised. But before that moment of surrender came something else. A lifetime of teaching that told them mercy didn't exist. Every belief they held was about to be tested. In one small village near the Rhine, a 14-year-old named Emil stood with his unit, clutching a single-shot Panzerfaust. He had been told that one man could stop a tank with courage, alone. He believed it until he saw the real thing, a steel giant crawling through the smoke, unstoppable. His knees buckled, his hands shook. For the first time, he wondered if everything they'd told him had been a lie. Across Germany, countless boys faced that same moment, the collision between myth and reality. They'd been raised to see themselves as saviors of a nation, but when they looked into the faces of their enemies, tired, human, unmonstrous, they began to see something else, confusion, pity, even kindness. But that came later. For now, in those final months, they were trapped between two worlds, one built on lies, the other they were too young to understand. The uniform made them soldiers, but their hearts were still children's. They had been promised heroism and found only hunger. They were told they'd fight for honor and instead fought for survival. And when the end finally came, when the sky filled with American planes and the roads flooded with retreating columns, the propaganda still whispered, "Hold the line, die with pride." Some obeyed, others dropped their weapons and ran. Yet no matter how the war ended for each of them, they shared the same beginning. A childhood stolen by ideology, reshaped into obedience, and sent marching into history's darkest chapter. They weren't born cruel. They were raised afraid. Afraid of failure, of shame, of what would happen if they didn't do what they were told. The line between belief and fear blurred until they became the same thing. So when those boys finally faced the Americans for the first time, their hearts raced not from hatred, but from terror. Terror of the punishment they were promised, of the monsters they'd been told to expect. They didn't know that what awaited them wasn't vengeance, but something far more powerful. Because the moment the Americans lowered their rifles, the lies began to crumble. And the boys who had been raised for war would begin to see the world for what it truly was, not black and white, not friend and enemy, but human. And that is where their story truly begins. The snow had started to melt, turning the dirt roads into rivers of gray slush. For days, the boys had been retreating, marching through ruined villages, half-starved, clutching their rifles like talismans. They didn't know where the front line was anymore. Every direction seemed to lead only deeper into chaos. Somewhere behind them, artillery thundered. Somewhere ahead, silence. Emil trudged beside Karl, both wrapped in tattered coats scavenged from an abandoned house. Their commander, a man barely 20, had vanished during the night. No orders, no direction, just the cold and the fear that the enemy was closing in. By then, most of them were too numb to care. They had spent weeks sleeping in barns and trenches, waiting for orders that never came. The world they'd been told to defend had already collapsed. And yet, they still walked, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant death, or so they believed. The morning was quiet when they saw movement on the horizon, dark shapes against the pale mist, vehicles, trucks, soldiers. Emil froze, his breath caught in his throat. "The Americans," Karl whispered. The word itself felt heavy, forbidden-like naming a ghost. The boys scrambled for cover, ducking behind a low stone wall at the edge of an orchard. The ground was slick with thawing snow. Their hands shook as they loaded their rifles, though few had the strength or the will to use them. "They'll kill us," one of the younger boys muttered. "That's what they do." The others said nothing. The stories they'd been told echoed in their minds. The Americans would burn, torture, laugh over their bodies. That was what the radio had promised. Minutes passed. The rumble of engines grew louder. Emil peered through the cracks in the wall. The soldiers approaching were unlike anything he'd imagined. Their uniforms were dusty, their faces tired. They didn't shout slogans or wave flags. They just moved slowly, cautiously, scanning the ruins ahead. The Americans looked human, ordinary. That was the first shock. One of them raised a hand, signaling for the convoy to halt. The others fanned out, rifles ready but not raised. A strange stillness fell over the orchard. Emil's heart hammered. He could see the steam of his breath in the cold air. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere left to run to. Then Carl whispered, "What do we do?" No one answered. The group huddled behind the wall, 6 boys, maybe 7. The oldest 17, the youngest barely 13. Each waited for the first shot, the one they'd been told would come without warning. But it didn't. Instead, a voice called out from across the field, steady, firm, not angry. The words were English, but the tone carried something strange. Patience. Another voice followed, then a gesture. A soldier lowering his weapon, just slightly. The boys hesitated. Emil's hands trembled so violently that he almost dropped his rifle. The barrel pointed nowhere. He wasn't thinking about courage anymore. He was thinking about his mother, about the warm bread she used to bake on Sundays, about how far away that world was now. Then, without deciding, he moved. He set his rifle down, slowly. The metal sank into the mud with a dull sound. His breath caught as he lifted his hands. "I surrender," he whispered, though the words were lost to the wind. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Carl followed. Then another. One by one, the rifles dropped. On the other side of the field, the American sergeant watched through his binoculars. "They're kids," he muttered. His men exchanged looks of disbelief. Orders were clear. Be cautious, no risks. But this wasn't an ambush. These weren't soldiers. "Hold fire," the sergeant said. "Move in, slow and easy." The Americans advanced, boots squelching through the slush. Their rifles stayed ready, but their eyes softened as they drew closer. What they found was a sight no training manual had prepared them for. The boys were shaking thin, exhausted, faces smudged with dirt. One still wore a school satchel over his shoulder. Another clutched a broken photograph in his pocket. None of them looked older than 17. Emil stared at the soldiers, waiting for the strike that never came. His breath trembled. Then one of the Americans, a tall corporal with tired eyes, reached into his coat and pulled out a canteen. He held it out, wordless. Emil blinked, confused. The corporal nodded gently. "Drink." The boy hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached out. The water was cold and clean. He hadn't tasted anything like it in days. He drank, almost choking, the liquid spilling down his chin. The Americans watched quietly. No one laughed, no one shouted. They didn't face anger, they faced understanding. Another soldier motioned for them to follow. "Come on, boys, it's over." The words carried across the orchard like a sigh. It's over. For a moment, no one moved. The idea seemed impossible after years of fear and orders and lies. But when the Americans turned and began walking back toward their trucks, the boys followed. Not because they were ordered to, but because they didn't know what else to do. As they crossed the muddy field, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time that week. It glinted off the puddles, off the helmets, off the rifles left behind. The war, at least for them, had stopped right there in that orchard. The American patrol led them to a small farmhouse used as a temporary command post. Inside, the air was warm from a wood stove. The smell of coffee filled the room, a smell so ordinary, so achingly normal, that it made Emil's throat tighten. The soldiers gestured for them to sit. The boys obeyed, backs straight, hands trembling in their laps. Every movement of the Americans made them flinch. When one of the GIs reached for his pack, 2 of the younger boys almost ducked under the table. But instead of weapons, the soldier pulled out tins of food. He opened one, set it down, and pushed it across the table. "Eat," he said softly. Carl stared at the contents beans and chunks of meat swimming in sauce. Real food. Not the dry crusts they'd been living on. He picked up the spoon and took a bite. Tears welled up before he could stop them. The Americans said nothing. They just watched quietly as the boys ate. Outside, the snow had stopped. The war was still raging miles away, but in that small room, there was only the crackle of the stove and the sound of spoons scraping tin. Emil looked up at one of the Americans, a sergeant with graying stubble and a scar along his jaw. Their eyes met. For a long second, neither looked away. Then the sergeant said, in slow, careful German, "No one will hurt you." It wasn't a command. It was a promise. The boys didn't know whether to believe him, but something in his tone, steady, tired, human, made them want to. Hours passed like that. The soldiers checked their papers, took notes, tended to minor wounds. One of the GIs, a medic from Ohio, examined a boy's frostbitten fingers, wrapping them gently in gauze. Another fixed a torn sleeve with a safety pin. The boys kept waiting for cruelty, for humiliation, but it never came. When night fell, the sergeant ordered blankets brought in. The Americans didn't call them prisoners. They said the boys would be taken under supervision. It was a small choice of words, but it mattered. They weren't treated like enemies. They were treated like children who had wandered too far into danger. Outside, the wind howled through the shattered village. Inside, the warmth spread slowly, cautiously, like trust. The boys spoke in whispers, sharing fragments of their stories. Emil told Carl he still couldn't believe they were alive. Carl just nodded. "Maybe we're dreaming," he said. One of the Americans, hearing the tone, if not the words, smiled faintly. "No, son," he murmured under his breath. "You're just done fighting." Later that night, as the fire burned low, the sergeant wrote in his report, "Encountered German youths under Volkssturm command, ages 13-17, malnourished, cooperative, no hostility shown, recommend humane treatment." He paused before signing his name, then added one final line. They didn't need enemies, they needed a chance. Outside, snow began to fall again, light, silent, erasing footprints in the mud. In the stillness of that German night, for the first time in years, mercy had found its way onto a battlefield. And somewhere, deep inside those boys who had been taught to fear and hate, something began to thaw. Morning came quietly, wrapped in fog. The war seemed to hold its breath. The American patrol had spent the night in the farmhouse, taking turns on watch while the young Germans slept in a corner near the stove. The fire had burned down to embers, but the air still held a trace of warmth, a fragile peace suspended between exhaustion and disbelief. When Emil woke, for a moment he didn't remember where he was. He saw the ceiling beams above him, the flicker of light on the walls, and thought he was home. Then the smell of coffee and the murmur of foreign voices brought him back to reality. Across the room, an American soldier was pouring hot water into tin cups. Another stood by the window, cleaning his rifle, not with aggression, but with the slow, practiced rhythm of habit. There was no shouting, no barking of orders, only calm. For the boys who had grown up in a world of slogans and commands, that calmness felt almost alien. Carl stirred beside him, rubbing his eyes. "Are we dead?" he whispered. Emil shook his head. "I don't think so." The door creaked open, and cold air spilled in. Sergeant Weller stepped inside, his breath misting in the morning chill. He looked at the boys, then at his men. "Get them some food," he said simply. No ceremony, no anger. Moments later, a corporal knelt and handed the boys a tray. Bread, a few biscuits, even a square of chocolate. The sight alone made Emil's stomach twist. He hadn't seen chocolate since before the bombing of Bremen. For a second, he didn't dare touch it. Was it a trick? A test? The American noticed his hesitation and smiled faintly. "Go on," he said, gesturing. "It's just chocolate." Emil took it carefully, the silver foil catching the morning light. When he bit into it, the sweetness hit like memory, sudden, overwhelming. His eyes burned, and he had to look away. It wasn't just the taste, it was everything it represented. Safety, childhood, a world before uniforms and orders. Carl let out a quiet laugh, not of joy, but disbelief. "They're feeding us," he said under his breath, as if the words themselves were impossible. Why? No one answered because none of them truly knew. But in that moment, something shifted. The fear that had clung to them since the day they were drafted began, just barely, to loosen its grip. After breakfast, the Americans led the boys outside. The fog was lifting, revealing a landscape of broken houses and quiet fields. Smoke still rose in thin columns from the horizon, the dying breath of a collapsing war. The boys were told to stay near the farmhouse. They weren't handcuffed, weren't shouted at. The Americans called it supervision, not captivity. That small difference mattered more than any of them could say. A medic set up a table near the barn and began checking each of them in turn. Frostbite, malnutrition, infected cuts, the damage of too many nights in the cold. He worked with a gentleness that confused them. Each time he touched a bandage or checked a pulse, the boys flinched, expecting pain or punishment. None came. One of the soldiers, Private Anderson, noticed Emil's shoes, cracked leather, soles half torn away. "Hold still," he said softly, and began wrapping strips of cloth around them. Emil watched him work, puzzled. "Warum?" he asked. "Why?" Anderson looked up, smiled tiredly. "Because you'll freeze otherwise." It was such a simple answer, yet it carried the weight of everything the boys had been taught to doubt. Compassion wasn't supposed to exist here, but it did. Later that day, the Americans let them warm themselves by the fire outside. Someone passed around canteens, another shared a pack of cigarettes. A few soldiers began talking quietly among themselves. The boys listened, not understanding the words, but catching the tone. Easy, human, even humorous. They weren't demons, these men. They laughed, complained about rations, teased each other like brothers. Emil leaned close to Carl. "They don't hate us," he whispered. Carl nodded slowly, still staring into the flames. "Maybe they should," he said. By noon, the fog had lifted completely. Sunlight spilled across the ruined fields, revealing the quiet aftermath of war. Trees stripped bare, walls reduced to shadows, the distant echo of artillery still murmuring beyond the river. Yet here, in this small patch of stillness, life persisted. The sergeant gathered his men. "We'll move out soon," he said. "Take them with us to the rear. No rough handling." The tone of command was firm, but not cruel. Orders given not to humiliate, but to protect. As the convoy formed, the boys followed in silence. The Americans gave them blankets for the ride, tucked them into the back of a truck. Emil sat near the tailgate, the wind brushing against his face as they drove through the countryside. Every mile carried them further from the myths they'd grown up with. They passed through villages reduced to rubble, chimneys standing like gravestones, carts overturned in ditches, livestock wandering aimlessly through the ruins. Yet in the midst of all that desolation, there were moments of strange beauty. A tree in bloom, a bird perched on a wire, the faint smell of spring breaking through the cold. For the boys, it was the first time they had seen the world without orders attached to it. When the convoy stopped for rest, the Americans let them stretch their legs by a bridge overlooking a shallow stream. Anderson handed out bread and tins of meat. The boys ate quietly, still unsure if they were allowed to speak. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the soldiers, a young man from Illinois with a crooked smile, pulled from his pocket a small bar of chocolate and handed it to the youngest boy in the group, Udo. The boy stared at it as if it were gold. "Go on," the soldier said, miming a bite. Otto looked around, hesitated, then smiled for the first time since anyone could remember. The soldier laughed softly, clapping him on the shoulder. For a moment, they weren't enemies at all. Just a man and a child sharing a simple human gesture. Emil watched, silent. He couldn't understand how easily these men could show kindness. Didn't they know what he'd been told? That mercy was weakness, that enemies could never be friends? But watching them, he began to understand something new, something no teacher had ever said aloud, that kindness was not weakness, it was strength. That evening, they reached a temporary American camp near the river. Tents lined the muddy field, and a kitchen fire burned near the center. The boys were led to a corner tent with cots, blankets, and a guard posted nearby, but no shouting, no fences. Inside, warmth returned. The soldiers checked on them through the night, bringing hot soup and coffee. The aroma filled the tent, foreign and comforting. Emil had never tasted coffee before. Its bitterness surprised him, but it felt alive, like something from another world. The Americans spoke softly to one another, sometimes laughing. One even tried a few words of German. "Alles gut?" The boys nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Laughter followed, light and genuine. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the firelight. Inside, the tension melted further. The youngest boys began to relax, some even dozing off. The guards watched over them not like wardens, but like tired fathers watching over children. When Sergeant Weller walked in, he stopped at the entrance and took in the sight. Boys wrapped in blankets, heads resting on their arms, faces finally calm. He exhaled slowly, then turned to his men. "They remind me of my kid brother," he said quietly. No one answered. They all felt it too. He moved closer to the fire and set down a pot of stew. "They'll remember this," he said. "Not the guns. This." Indeed, later that night, one of the American soldiers produced a harmonica from his pack. The tune he played was soft and low, winding through the tent like smoke. The melody was neither German nor American, just human. The boys listened, half asleep, their faces flickering in the firelight. For some, it was the first song they'd heard in months that wasn't about marching or dying. Emil lay awake long after the others had drifted into dreams. He thought about the chocolate, the bread, the kindness. He thought about his home, about the stories he'd been told, about monsters and cruelty and endless hatred, and none of it matched what he'd seen. He whispered into the dark, half to himself, "They didn't have to feed us." The words lingered, soft and uncertain, like a prayer. Outside, the guards talked quietly. One said, "Back home, these kids would be in school." The other replied, "Back home, they'd be playing baseball." They both fell silent after that. By morning, the war had not ended, but something inside these boys had. The walls built by propaganda were starting to crack. For the first time, they were beginning to see not enemies, not uniforms, but people. And as they sat by the fire that day, eating warm soup under a sky still gray with smoke, they understood something no speech could have taught them. That mercy is not a trick. That kindness can survive even war. That day, they were not prisoners. They were children again. The war didn't end with silence. It ended with disbelief. For days, rumors spread through the American camps. The Reich had collapsed. Berlin was surrounded. The Führer was dead. But the news came so softly, so strangely, that no one knew whether to celebrate or mourn. When Emil first heard the words translated through the interpreter, he didn't react. He sat by the edge of the campfire, staring at the ground. "It's over," the interpreter said again. "The war is finished. Over. Finished." Words that should have felt like salvation only left him hollow. Because when a world built on lies collapses, it doesn't vanish. It lingers inside you, whispering doubts even as the truth stands before your eyes. The Americans didn't cheer, either. Most of them just stared toward the horizon, where the sky burned faintly red over the Rhine. They had fought too long, lost too many friends to find joy in the ashes. That night, the camp was quiet except for the sound of boots in the mud and the soft crackle of the fires. The German boys sat apart, wrapped in blankets that still smelled faintly of smoke and soap. They spoke in low voices, half afraid to disturb the fragile peace that hung over them. Emil turned to Carl. "Do you think we'll go home?" Carl shrugged. "If there's anything left to go to." Neither of them said the word guilt, but it sat between them all the same. They had fought, barely, clumsily, fearfully, for something that had consumed their world. They hadn't chosen it, but they had obeyed it. And now, obedience felt like a stain that would never wash away. The next morning, a chaplain visited the camp. He wasn't there to preach victory. He spoke softly, through a translator, his words simple. "You are alive. That is the beginning of something new." The boys listened, their faces unreadable. Emil didn't understand all the English, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of forgiveness, something he had almost forgotten existed. After the sermon, the chaplain lingered near the fire. He knelt beside one of the youngest boys, Otto, whose uniform hung off him like a costume. "How old are you?" he asked gently. Otto hesitated. 13, the chaplain nodded slowly. "You should be home, not here." Otto looked up. "Home is gone." The chaplain had no answer. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then start again. You're young enough to build something better." That phrase, "build something better," echoed through Emil's mind for days. The Americans soon began dismantling the temporary camp. Trucks arrived, carrying supplies and refugees. The soldiers were tired but kind, making sure the boys were fed, checked by medics, and given proper clothes. No chains, no shouting, just quiet order. Every act of care felt like a small miracle. One afternoon, as the camp prepared to move east, a soldier named Hayes found Emil sitting by the riverbank, watching the water drift past. The boy looked lost in thought, his fingers tracing shapes in the mud. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," Hayes said, crouching beside him. Emil smiled faintly. "Maybe I do." "You shouldn't," Hayes replied. "That's our job. Yours is to learn how to live again." Emil looked at him, puzzled. "How?" "Start small," Hayes said. "Remember the good things, keep them alive. The world has enough men who only remember hate." The boy nodded slowly. He wanted to believe it. That evening, a Red Cross truck arrived at the camp, bringing blankets, biscuits, and a few letters from home. Most of the boys had no families left to write to them, but a few clung to the hope that someone still waited. One of the soldiers read aloud a letter from his wife back in Ohio. The language was foreign, but the sound of it, soft, affectionate, normal, made the boys smile. For a moment, they could almost imagine that kind of life. As night fell, Emil took out the harmonica Hayes had given him days earlier. The metal felt cold in his hands. He turned it over, studying the dents and scratches. "For when you forget what peace sounds like," Hayes had said. He raised it to his lips and played a slow, uncertain tune. The notes wavered but carried across the camp, threading through the tents and over the fires. One by one, the soldiers fell quiet to listen. Even the guards paused. The melody wasn't perfect, but it was human, fragile, sincere, alive. Carl whispered, "You're getting better." Emil smiled. "Maybe I'm remembering." The next morning, the trucks came to take them to a larger processing camp near Koblenz. The boys climbed aboard, carrying what little they had: a blanket, a cup, a scrap of bread. No one resisted. No one cried. They just sat in silence as the convoy rumbled through the countryside. Outside, spring had finally arrived. Fields were turning green again. Birds followed the trucks overhead, their songs faint but clear. For the first time, the boys didn't look at the world through fear. They saw life, fragile, stubborn, beautiful, growing out of ruins. Along the road, civilians watched as the convoy passed. Some spat, others stared. A few offered bread or water. The Americans accepted politely, never letting their charges go hungry. At one stop, a farmer's wife approached the truck with a basket of apples. She looked at the boys, dirty, thin, silent, and her eyes softened. "Kinder," she murmured. "They're just children." She handed the fruit to the soldiers. "For them." The boys ate in silence, each bite tasting like forgiveness. When they arrived at the new camp, the Americans processed them quickly. Names, ages, hometowns. Most were released to refugee shelters within weeks. Some were reunited with what remained of their families. Others simply disappeared into the post-war chaos, faces among millions trying to start again. But those few days, the orchard, the farmhouse, the kindness, stayed with them forever. Years later, Emil would write about it in a small notebook he kept hidden through the decades. "We were taught to see monsters," he wrote, "and found men. We were told to hate and were met with mercy. I learned that day that truth can be gentler than fear." He would go on to rebuild his life in a quiet town near Bremen, become a teacher, and tell his students not about glory or battle, but about humanity, about the moment he learned that compassion was stronger than propaganda. And when he spoke, his students would listen in silence, because the tremor in his voice carried something real, the sound of someone who had seen both darkness and light and chosen which one to remember. The other boys scattered across Germany found their own ways forward. Some never spoke of the war again. Others joined the efforts to rebuild, to heal. Each carried the same invisible scar and the same quiet gratitude toward the men who had spared them, not just from death, but from the lie that enemies must always be hated. War had raised them. Humanity had saved them. And in that, perhaps, lay the smallest victory of all. For the Americans who had shown mercy, it wasn't about forgiveness or politics. It was instinct, the simple, stubborn belief that decency could survive even amid destruction. They had seen enough cruelty to know what mercy was worth. When they left Germany months later, most of them never saw the boys again. But some kept their memories, the thin faces, the shaking hands, the nervous smiles when they tasted chocolate for the first time in years. They carried those images home like photographs burned into the heart. One soldier, Private Anderson, would later tell his wife, "The strangest thing about that war wasn't the killing. It was how human it could still feel, even at the end. Because in that moment, when rifles lowered and hands rose in surrender, the world had shifted, just slightly, but forever." The propaganda that raised those boys had failed not because it was defeated by guns, but because it met something stronger: empathy. And maybe that was the quiet truth the war left behind. That mercy is not weakness, that kindness is not surrender, that to see someone's humanity, even when you've been told not to, is the bravest act of all. As the sun set over the Rhine that final evening, Emil looked out from the truck window, the harmonica in his hands. The river shimmered gold in the fading light. He lifted the instrument and played softly to himself, the melody drifting behind them like a goodbye. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a boy again, and for the first time, free.